Likers family, hope you guys are having a great day. I'm your host, Rocky Roark, and in today's episode, I am thrilled to bring you the second installment of our transformative 6-part mini-series. That's kind of a mouthful there. How communication can make or break your freelancing business. If you caught our first episode, you know how pivotal the first interaction with a potential client can be. It's a digital handshake that can set the trajectory for your entire business relationship. And today we are going to be talking about how setting expectations, like the contract and scope of work, are super, super important. But before we do, let's actually jump into a quick little hot topic for today's episode, and also give a shout out to the listener of the week. So today's hot topic involves job titles, and that is titles don't matter, so stop chasing them. There's been many times in my career and also in friends' careers where I've seen them chasing titles. When I was a young designer, I was so hell-bent on getting the title of art director. That's what I wanted. And it kind of led me into some trouble with one of the agencies that I worked at early on. I made the mistake of telling someone at the agency, or telling my manager at the agency, that my goal was to become an art director. And she assumed that I meant as an art director at the company. And that is not true. I wanted to eventually become an art director, but I didn't want to necessarily be an art director there. I was thinking of being an art director at my own company, or being an art director maybe in-house at some startup. And so it quickly led to this title chasing endeavor that wasn't even my choosing. It was something that she kind of set forth for me. And so in reality, the title that you have, whether it's a junior designer, mid-level designer, senior designer, art director, creative director, it doesn't really matter. I currently have a title of design director, and I have titles as fractional creative directors at a couple of companies. And honestly, it all means basically the same. It means that I manage creative talent for these companies and for my own design studio, and that's basically all it means. And the other side of that too is not just like the where you are in your title, right? The levels you are in your title, but also what you call yourself. You know, many people, they call themselves UI UX designers, they call themselves experience designers, they call themselves product designers, brand designers, graphic designers, and everything. And no matter what, I just like the term designer. You know, I don't think that there's anything wrong with just calling yourself a designer. You don't have to add, I guess you would call it maybe an adjective. I'm horrible with grammar, so I don't know if that's the right term, but you don't have to add some sort of crazy thing onto it to make yourself seem smarter. You know, when I refer to myself as a designer and you look at my background, you'll notice I've done work in branding design. I've done work in illustration. I've done work in marketing. I've done work in product design, web design, like so many different, aspects of the creative field. And yet I just prefer the moniker designer. Like there's nothing wrong with that. So don't feel like that you have to go chasing these fancy titles. You don't have to be set in one specific bucket or the other. The only thing that really gives you a bump with those types of hierarchical or ranking titles like senior, junior, director, and things like that is just pay bumps. That's all it is. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily a great designer. I've known many art directors, many creative directors who couldn't design themselves out of the paper bag because they have been so far removed from the creative process. And you honestly don't want to end up like that. You want to make sure that you are who you are, and a title does not tell people who you are as a creative, as a person. So this is kind of an inflated hot topic today, but I just wanted to share that with all of you. All right. And so the listener of the week for this week is Andrew. I'm going to try and say your name without messing it up. Andrew Sterlacini. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Thank you so much, Andrew, for listening to us. He sent a DM to me recently, letting me know how much he was enjoying the podcast episode, how excited he was for Dan Blessing's episode, which is already live, and Kyle Van Cleese's episode, which is also already live. And so thank you so much, Andrew, for tuning in. You can find him on Twitter at mean, MEANS, means, 1974. I believe, if I remember correctly from your Twitter profile, he actually is a designer at Adidas, which is really, really cool. All right, so let's jump back into today's episode. So today we are going to be zeroing in on an aspect that may not seem glamorous, but it truly is the backbone of any successful freelance project, and that is setting expectations, specifically around the lines of the contract and the scope of work. Now, many of you might not believe this is really about communication, but it truly is. The contract that you write up, or the statement of work, or whatever it is that you produce that outlines everything entailing the project, or everything that the project entails, is super important for communication. You can almost think of it almost like as your Bible or something like that. Your North Star for the engagement or in future engagements, depending on the type of contract. So imagine that you're about to kind of like take a cross country road trip. Would you set off without a map, without knowing your stops or what resources you'll need along the way? No, probably not. Absolutely not. In the same vein, a well-defined contract acts as your roadmap, guiding you and your client through the complex journey of a project, preventing you from veering off into troubled territories of misunderstandings, unmet expectations, and financial dead ends. Think about on was it National Lampoon's Vacation, when Clark W. Griswold drives his station wagon off the road and it goes flying. You don't want that to happen to your project, right? You want to make sure that it stays on course. You want to make sure that you're happy, that the client is especially happy. We all know that happy clients mean more work, means more referrals, means testimonials. It means a very lucrative freelancing business. So we're not just going to talk about the basic, contract clauses that you should include. Oh no, we're going to go deep into exploring how to craft your contract as a powerful communication tool that aligns you and your client from day one. The aim is to shift your perspective from seeing a contract as merely a formality to viewing it as an integral, I think that's how you say it, part of your professional toolkit. A tool that not only safeguards your interests, but also fosters a transparent and fruitful collaboration with your client. So basically, from detailing deliverables to setting clear timelines and even utilizing your contract for quality assurance and post-product care, this episode will arm you with actionable insights to elevate your freelancing practice. So trust me here, you do not want to overlook today's episode. It might just save your next freelance project from falling apart or even your next client relationship. So get your notebooks, get ready, open them up, take out your note-taking app, whatever it is, because we're about to dive in. First off, let me just give a quick disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. I am not, a legal professional and everything. I am not going to give you a blank template of a contract. What we are going to be doing here is we're going to be clarifying specific things that you should focus on with your contract, with your statement of work. We're going to be talking about, how to define certain things like timelines, clarifying deliverables, payment terms, revisions and scope creep protection, which is very important, intellectual property ownership, and also client responsibilities, because most times we don't even think about that, what the client is responsible in the project. So let's go ahead and dive in. So we're going to first talk about clarity in deliverables. So basically what you want to do here and what we're talking about is making sure, to use clear language, avoid any type of industry jargon, technical terms that could be open to interpretation. You want to make sure that you specify things, and that if you do use jargon, if there's no other recourse but to use specific industry jargon, put notes, put little captions at the bottom or footnotes at the bottom of your contract, statement of works, things like that, specifically outlining those terms and what you mean by them. Also, no matter what, and this is something I should send a disclaimer to, whatever you do, make sure that you take your contract. If you have a template, which you should always have some sort of template drawn up of your contract, take it to a legal professional and get them to review it, get them to say yes to things, make sure that everything is iron tight. And if there are areas that, you need to fix them. It's very good. I actually need to get one myself. I don't have one myself. I used to, and I don't anymore. But find yourself a legal professional who you can reach out to. It might cost you, 50, $150, something like that, to have them review a contract, but it will save you in the long run. And you can always include that as part of your admin fee on projects when you have to or when you need to. But it's definitely important to have a legal professional review them. But make sure that you are detailed, in everything, all the different deliverables, all the revision cycles, especially. That's something very, very important. Outline every feature, every deliverable, and even the technology that you're going to be using for the work. So like the fact that you're going to use Figma, the fact that you're going to possibly have a monthly Figma charge that you're going to share with them. Like I think it's $15, right? Make sure you outline that there is a Figma charge in your contract, so that when you send them an invoice, like if it's a monthly retainer or long-term contract, that they don't get scared when they see a $15 charge per user. And this is very good for big companies where you have lots of people. I've had clients where at one point they were paying, or I was paying $180 for all the Figma editing capabilities for all these people. And that's a lot of money. And I want to make sure that in my contract, it states that they have to reimburse me for those items. With revision cycles, especially if it's a project-based, situation, you want to make sure that you outline specifically how many revisions you allow for this project or for specific milestones. It's very, very important to do so. So basically, the bottom line here is precise and clear deliverables in your contract to eliminate any gray areas and set clear boundaries for what the project entails. A lot of times you'll have either a contract or a master services agreement, and then you'll have a statement of work, which will be like your clarifying document. It'll be like exhibit A or exhibit B that is mentioned in your contract. And that's where you can really go and define specific areas that might, include revisions, timelines, and things like that. Speaking of timelines, define your timeline. It's very important that you define a timeline, or at least an estimate. I never define a strict timeline in any of my contracts, in any of my statement of works, because things change. Things are always changing in the tech world, in the business world, in the freelancing world. And so you want to make sure that you cover, your bases. So what I do is I always share an estimated timeline. This is the estimated start date. This is the estimated completion date, or the estimated final deadline for the project. And by having those specifically laid out as estimates and saying in the notes, like, hey, this is an estimate for the specific deadline. This deadline may change depending on a few factors, such as waiting on information from the client, waiting on the initial payment to get started, because you never get started on a project until you get paid. Number 3, let's see, what's a good one? Making sure, like, getting feedback. That's probably one of the biggest things too, is a lot of times clients sometimes will take time in getting you feedback. Most of the time, it's very difficult to get feedback from clients right away. We're actually working on a creative sprint right now with a client, and we are basically doing live updates with the client. We share an update, the client gives us feedback. We then go back, design, share an update, the client gives us feedback. Now, in most situations, we don't do it that way. In this situation, they have a very strict deadline that they have to hit. And so in order to help them as their creative partners, we are upping our number of hours that we're going to do for this project, which means more money towards us. And we are helping them to hit these deadlines by doing this kind of change in our process. And so you want to outline things like that. You want to make sure that you cover these timeline bases, so that, when the timeline does change, because a lot of times it will, but if the timeline does change, you can point to, hey, I understand, we have to go through and do an extra round of revision. The timeline is going to change. There's no way that we can stick to this timeline because of this revision. Or you can use it as a way of increasing the hourly rate, or sorry, not hourly rate, but the number of hours that you're working with, like in my situation. But the bottom line is, with timelines, is a detailed timeline fosters accountability and helps to manage expectations on both ends, reducing the risk of conflicts later on. By having those estimated timelines, you are showing them that there is nothing set in stone. Things can change and will change. And so we just have to be able to act like adults and move with the changes, pivot with the changes. So it's very important. The next part of this is payment terms. This is very, very important, and many people do it completely different. We did an entire mini series on this on pricing, variable pricing for freelancers. There is project-based pricing. There is hourly-based pricing. There is retainers. There is design subscriptions, which I am now not a fan of. I'm going to be doing an episode about this at some point. But I have come to a conclusion that design subscriptions are not worth it and should not take over your freelancing business. So do not do that if that's the case. But you can see there's many different ways that you go about this. Let's use a couple of examples. So let's use just like a regular project, a one-time engagement type situation. What I like to do is I like to get paid 50% up front and then 50% plus any additionals on the final invoice. Now, in these situations, there is one big main problem with this, and you have to make sure that you manage this on your own side, is that if the project is going to be multiple months in a row versus like a project's going to be a couple weeks or 1 month, but this, let's say a project is 6 months, it's going to take 6 months, getting that 50% up front and then having the other 50% plus additionals or residuals or whatever you want to call it at the end, that's a huge gap in between those two payments. So in those situations where I do find myself looking at a very long-term project, I do not suggest doing a project-based pricing model. Instead, I would do a contract model where you get paid monthly for the number of hours that you work on the project. That way, you're getting paid throughout the entire course of the project, and you're not starving for that final payment. In the case, though, that you are doing a project-based system, the 50% upfront plus the 50% plus the residuals or additionals is a very easy model to follow. A lot of clients agree to it. The one thing is that you want to make sure that the 50% upfront gets paid at the start of the project. You will not start until then. And usually the final invoice for that will be paid in a series of net 15, maybe net 30. Anything beyond that is ridiculous. I always make sure, and I have actually turned down work with clients because they had unrealistic payment terms. So you want to make sure that not only you figure out like when you're going to get paid, or how you're going to get paid, whether it's a 50% upfront, 50% upon completion, but you also want to make sure you figure out when you're going to get paid. So when that final invoice is going to get paid. For the most part, with any long-term projects that I have or long-term engagements, my payment term is net 15. So they have to pay me within 15 days of that initial, or of the invoice being sent to them or being due to them. That way, it gives me basically 2 weeks or basically half of a month where, I have a little bit of leeway and then I know I'm going to get paid. I do not do net 30 for long-term projects unless there are specific stipulations. Sometimes I will bend that a little bit, but for the most part, I prefer net 15. If a client, has to have net 30 in the contract, but they generally pay early, perfectly fine. I'm open to it at that point. But some of my clients, they pay as early as net 5, or some pay net 18. Sometimes it goes a little bit over, especially around holidays, and you have to kind of like allow that, or you have to be able to be flexible for that. But it's very important that you stipulate in your contracts a specific net number for payment terms. Very, very important. So let's actually talk about retainer clients real quick. We're supposed to be talking about communication. This is kind of very important to communicate. One of the biggest pitfalls in communication when it comes to retainers is the number of hours that you are going to be working for the client. And that falls under a specific umbrella of certain months have 4 weeks, some have 5 weeks, some may even have less than that. And so what I do is I make it very clear that if, let's say, I have a client who is hiring me for 20 hours a week, I make sure to put a cap or I put a specific number with that. So it doesn't just say 20 hours per week. It says 20 hours per week, 80 hours total for the month. That way they know, okay, no matter, that's how many hours that they have for the full month. Some weeks will be more than 20, some weeks will be less than 20. And so it's very important that you outline these things and you communicate that to the client. When I was first working as a freelancer and I had retainer clients, I did not communicate that with them. I did not know how to communicate that with them. And so what was happening was they were assuming that I was going to work 100 plus hours on 5-week months at the same exact price that they were paying. So I think at the time they were paying, I think, $5,000 for 15 hours a week, I believe. And they assumed that on one client in particular assumed that I was going to be working a 5-week month, which I think is like September or November, something like that. And I told them, unfortunately, I'm not going to be working that. And they ended up ending the engagement because they assumed that they were going to be getting this like sweetheart deal twice a year, where on the 5-week months that they were going to get this, and I refused to do it. And so we ended up ending the engagement, and I lost the client. And it was very difficult. It was definitely difficult, but it was something of a learning experience for me. I learned very early from that experience to communicate with my clients my specific terms for retainers. Another thing too is communicating with clients with retainers on when or what they're paying for. So with retainers, there's 2 different ways of paying for hours. There is prepaying. So they're prepaying you for X number of hours per month, or they're post-paying, which means that they're paying after you've worked so many hours each month. And generally what I like to do is I like to give clients who prepay a little bit of a discount from time to time versus the clients that post pay, just because they are agreeing to pay me ahead of time. And if for some reason that there's extra hours, either they fizzle out or they get carried over one extra month and then they fizzle out. And so it's kind of like a lot of trust that's being made there. And so I reward my clients who trust me. So basically the bottom line is transparent discussions and documentations on payment terms eradicate financial misunderstandings and set the stage for smooth working relationships. Okay, now let's move on to something that's definitely a very important topic, which is revision and scope creep protection. So with this is probably one of the hardest things that designers and freelancers tend to run into with clients is scope creep. This is the death of freelance projects. It is the death and burnout igniter for a lot of freelancers. I know it was for me multiple times in my career. So it is important to be explicit and state clearly how many revisions are included in the initial cost and what additional revisions would cost if they needed them. So it's very important to clearly communicate this with your client, because a lot of times if you do not communicate this, they will assume that there's unlimited revisions. And by including this in your contract, your statement of work, you're kind of safeguarding your time, you're safeguarding yourself and your freelance business. With preventing scope creep, include a provision in your contract for how additional tasks or modifications will be billed. So a lot of times, let's talk about the project-based way of tackling this, because this is probably more important. With the project-based system, you have that initial 50%, which covers the first half of your estimated cost. Then you have that second invoice, that second payment, which covers your other 50% plus any additionals. What we're talking about with, adding the additional task or adding additional pieces of scope or revisions here is we're talking about those additional pieces. So what I like to do in my statement of work is I like to include additional revisions will be invoiced at, let's say $100 an hour for each additional hour of revision. And so that way they know, okay, this is how much revisions are going to cost. And if we have a revision, I let the client know, I communicate to them as per our statement of work. This will probably cost us an extra $500 added to the invoice. It'll probably take about 5 hours at the $100 an hour. And so by including that information in the statement of work, I've covered myself, and now I'm going to get paid for that extra time and hours. So with even prioritizing the communication even further, make sure, to encourage open dialogue, when revisions or additional tasks come up. Make sure to talk to them. Don't get, angry. Don't get upset. Don't get stressed. Don't get disappointed when clients want revisions and changes. It's going to happen. It always does, right? So it's very important that you make sure to communicate that with your client and make it be known to them that you are open for additional revisions and changes as long as they're not abusing it. 1 or 2 rounds of extra revisions, as long as they're paid for, it's okay. But if it starts getting to 5 revisions, that's something to be, nervous about. So the bottom line here is outlining in your guidelines, in your statement of work, your contract and everything like that, outlining guidelines for revisions and scope changes not only saves you from future headaches, but it also positions you as a professional who has control over your work processes. All right, and now we have, I think 2 more main points that we're going to talk about. The next one involves intellectual property and ownership. Now, this is something I'll talk about. I will be 100% honest and frank with all of you. I generally do not do a lot of usage rights and things like that in my contracts. What I do is I define the ownership clearly, clearly stating, who owns the finished work and any other, deliverables in the contract. So what my clients pay for is they pay for the complete ownership of the rights to any artwork and design that I create for them. But they do not own the working files for designs. They own all the final assets, but not the working files. There are some exceptions to that. And some clients, request for those exceptions, and, depending on, what they are and what they need, that can also influence the overall price. So you have to communicate with them that they will have the ownership of X, Y, and Z, and then you retain the ownership of A, B, and C. It's very important that you communicate that to them. And then with usage rights, this comes down to mostly with illustrators. Illustrators and photographers, and probably even copywriters too, would fall under this category. Usage rights are very important to outline in your contracts, specifically showing things like licensing, making sure to state how what kind of license they have for the stuff that you create. Because no matter what, according to US, and this is specifically for US, I don't know about elsewhere, but in the US, the creator of the digital thing, whether it's an illustration, even a logo too, if I'm not mistaken, they have the first chance at copyright. So that means that you could go and take your illustration that you created, and you can go and take it and get it copyrighted, and then you have the ownership. The client does not have first stab at that. You do. Now, what you're doing in your contract a lot of times is you're giving up that right at copyright. But there are a lot of things with usages, with specific types of illustrations and things like that. One of the other things with, ownership with intellectual property is licensing. This is something that's very, very important, especially for illustrators, photographers, copywriters, being able to specify the ownership of the work, and also the licensing of it. When you license something to a client, they can use that work for one specific purpose or whatever purpose you outline in your contract, and that is it. If they want to license it for other things, they have to then come back to you and pay an additional licensing fee. I have never been a big fan of that. Even when I was a full-time illustrator, I actually just completely gave up or I didn't give up. I sold all ownership of the work to my clients, with the exception of a couple of projects that I did for companies like Adobe. I didn't sell the full rights to them. They actually told me not to. And then they came back and actually paid me to be able to use the designs for additional things later on. So that was pretty cool of them to do that. But generally, I don't like doing that. It's too much hassle trying to handle those and mitigate those types of things. But it is something that you want to make sure that you include in your contract. So the bottom line here is clearly define intellectual property and confidential terms, avoid potential legal entanglements, and ensure both parties know their rights and obligations. And then the final thing that we have here is client responsibilities. This is something that a lot of freelancers tend to overlook, is that your clients still have responsibilities. You are not their employee. You are their partner, and that's what you should be striving for, is to be their partner. So you want to make sure that the client's responsibilities are all outlined. So number one, one of the first things that you want to include here is feedback. Clients need to get you feedback as quickly and clearly as possible. In my contract, I actually have communicated that if a client goes 5 to 7 business days without giving me feedback or without following up with me, that it is a strike against them, and it could be lines for termination of the contract. Same thing goes with repeated offenders of this too. If a client is taking 5 days at a time to get feedback, then you need to be able to communicate to them like, hey, this is kind of going against our contract here. We need to get better about this, or we're going to have to end the engagement, or we're going to have to fire you as a client. Another aspect is getting you the information, period, or even getting your stuff paid on time. We had a project a couple months back where or not a couple months, it was actually at the beginning of the year, where we canceled the project. We fired the client before we even got started because they took, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks before they were going to get us payment turn or get our initial payment done. And so we're sitting there with this spot being held for the client, and we're like following up like, hey, we're still waiting on payment. What's going on? It's with accounting. They said it should be going out soon. 3 weeks go by, still nothing. Oh, it looks like there was an issue. It should be going out next week. And that's where we ended up ending the engagement. We communicated like, we're sorry. Unfortunately, we cannot, in good conscience, continue with this engagement because of these continued delays with this. And they were fine with it. They were okay. We had signed the contracts and everything, but because we had those terms in there, we were able to save ourselves from potential problems later on. But making sure that you have those clearly defined things like feedback, payment, and all these other things, those are very important client responsibility. Being on time for meetings. One of the biggest things that I am a stickler for is being on time to meetings. Now, I understand things happen. I understand, other meetings go beyond, things pop up, and you want to make sure to, go about this your own way. My personal feeling is if a client is 15 minutes late, then I just drop the call. Even if they message me a few minutes later, like, oh, hey, I'm in the call. Where are you? Well, it's been 15 minutes. Like you've missed the meeting. And I include that in my contracts. Like it's their responsibility to let me know if they are going to be late, or to let me know if they need to reschedule ahead of time versus rescheduling 5 minutes before a meeting. And what I generally do is in my contracts, it states that, basically the clients have three strikes and they're out, so to speak. And not in those specific terms, but, if this happens 3 times, that is room for me to cancel the project and fire the client. And so you want to make sure to have consequences for those as well. So there's a lot of things, and we could go super deep into client responsibilities, but I think you guys get the gist. Make sure, that detailing the client responsibilities in your contracts and statement of work really helps to create a balanced 2-way relationship with your client, and communicating, when they are kind of like treading that fine line of, following their responsibilities and not following their responsibilities. And there we have it, folks. Whew. We've reached the end of this game-changing episode of the Design Break podcast, the second installment in our enlightened 6-part mini-series, How Communication Can Make or Break Your Freelancing Business. Today, we tackled the often overlooked, monumentally important topic of setting expectations, the contract and scope of work. Let me just say, too, like, a lot of these things you might not see as communication, but these are hallmarks for communication when it comes to dealing with your clients, or with not even dealing with your current clients, but partnering with your clients. So if there is one takeaway from today's discussion, let it be this: a well-crafted contract or statement of work is far more than a bureaucratic necessity. It's your project's blueprint. It's your safety net and a cornerstone in building a transparent, respectful, and enduring relationship with your client. By being meticulous in setting your terms and outlining deliverables, you are laying a rock-solid foundation for a successful project and a successful relationship with your client every single time. But before we wrap up, if you guys are not subscribed to the Design Break podcast, be sure to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasting fix, whether it's on YouTube or it is on Apple Podcasts. If you have not found us on YouTube, you can find us by at Rocky Roark, and we usually upload all of the episodes to my personal account. You can also find us on Twitter, where we're at the Design Break. Be sure to engage with us, engage with our content, and you may become the listener of the week, which this week it was, just to give a secondary shout out, the listener of the week was Andrew Sterlachini. Hopefully I'm saying your name right. I do apologize. But be sure to follow us on Twitter and engage with us. We're also going to be working on putting content out on Instagram moving forward, as well as TikTok. Maybe there's already been new content going out on both of those platforms. Next week, we are going to be digging into another compelling aspect of freelance communication, one that can either elevate your client relationship to a new height or bring it crashing down. So trust me, you won't want to miss it. If you have found any value in today's episode, please consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcast. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also makes it easier for other freelancers and design enthusiasts to find the podcast. But that's it for today's episode. Remember to stay passionate, stay positive, stay creative. Hope you guys have a great day. Bye.